Who am I? What does it mean to be an I and to be a self? To be this thing that I attribute a name to, and that I can talk about doing things that I know so well that I'm convinced this is me. How we come to know that concept is the key project of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan in his Ecrits. Now, Lacan is one of the formative figures of psychoanalysis along with Sigmund Freud. And what Lacan is trying to do is try to figure out how we come to know a concept of the self, or our subjecthood. How does this self-image, and image is an important word here, how does this self-image get built up and developed in a social context? And how is it dependent upon this social context? In order to do this, he highlights a particular stage in infantile development, known as the mirror stage, which is the moment when a child first recognizes their self in their reflection in a mirror. This coincides with a fundamental fracturing of the self, which leads to a fundamental state of madness that is going to come to define the subject. I would like to discuss in this lecture two essays from the Ecrits: The Mirror Stage as Formative of the I Function from 1949, and Presentation on Psychical Causality from 1946. These two essays are really good byways into Lacan because they help connect Lacan's philosophy to what's going on in Hegel and Marx, and helps make sense of how is Lacan used in a contemporary scene, because he's very important in, for example, the philosophy of Slavoj Žižek, who uses Lacan to interpret Hegel. Now zoom back for a moment and think of what Hegel is doing in the phenomenology of spirit in his famous master-slave dialectic. I've done several lectures on this concept, so if you need some help on that, you can check those out. But in its most fundamental sense, what the master-slave dialectic is about is how one develops a sense of identity, and particularly how identity depends upon recognition. And this is key because this brings identity into the social sphere and into the historical sphere, and thus, by extension, into the political sphere. Because what happens is we can no longer maintain a sort of isolated selfhood, the likes of which we see in Descartes, for example. Descartes' notion of the subject is the cogito, the thinking thing. This leads him to say cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. To be what I am is to be a thinking thing, and that corresponds with a particular substance, which pertains to the cogito, which is different from the substance of other things. And this is its essence. It is both a substance and it's also a function, a thing that it does, which is thinking. Now, this is something that Descartes can maintain even when he goes into a state of radical doubt, where he pretends that he can just doubt everything else that he believes or that he thinks he believes, and he can find some indubitable, firm foundation. Now, Hegel says, in fact, that my notion of selfhood is deeply implicated in the relations that others have to me. And what happens is when I have myself living in the world, I don't just immediately recognize myself as a self, as something unique amongst everything else. This sense of selfhood has to be developed through social interaction, in particular through the other, which becomes essentially the slave of my sense of self-identity, needs to recognize my own identity. So I become the master of my identity who defers it onto an other who is then going to respond to my identity by essentially submitting to it and recognizing it and giving it back to me. And this interchange is the dialectic of recognition. And there's a tricky thing that has to go on here, because the master cannot absorb the slave. It cannot raise them to the ground and force them to submit totally, because then the other is destroyed. And without the other, there is no self. So there is a dialectic which needs to be maintained in which the other is both necessary for one's identity, but also necessarily must be overcame, because I'm trying to get back to myself by coming out of myself. And this is a particularly somewhat contradiction-fraught aspect of Hegel's philosophy. He famously dispels with the law of non-contradiction. But what's important to know about Hegel here is this way in which my subjecthood is understood through its deferral to an other. Now, Lacan develops this in a very similar light, where he says, okay, there reaches a certain moment in a child's life when they first are able to recognize themselves in a mirror as themselves. And like, I'm looking in my viewfinder right now, I can see my hand moving and whoa, it maps directly onto what I'm doing. Except it is not a one-to-one mapping insofar as, first off, there is a lag insofar as that thing is not me. It's an other in which I'm seeing my reflection. And also, because of that, there is a sense of alienation, of I have been detached from myself in order to understand myself. What happens here is we begin to recognize what Lacan calls the I function. Instead of the I, this thing that I call me, being some primordial substance ontologically, like the cogito, no, this is a function which is necessarily social and contingent, and it gets developed over time. Lacan says this experience sets us at odds with any philosophy directly stemming from the cogito. So he's very directly there making a differentiation between him and Descartes, although he will at one point call for a revitalization of Descartes. So he's kind of got an interesting relationship to him. But another name for the mirror stage is the Aha-Erlebnis, the aha experience, where I go, oh, that's me right there. Look at that. How cool that is. You know, and you get enamored by making all these movements. If you're ever in like a gym where there's a bunch of mirrors next to each other and you get that cool kind of tunneling effect where you get an infinite cascade of mirrors and you watch your hand move and you see how there's like no lag and you're like, whoa, that's crazy. That's the sort of aha-Erlebnis that's going on here. And what happens here is that Lacan says this form situates the agency known as the ego prior to its social determination in a fictional direction that will forever remain irreducible for any single individual, or rather that will only asymptotically approach the subject's becoming, no matter how successfully the dialectical syntheses by which he must resolve, as I, his discourse with his own reality. So what happens is I have this lived reality of being in this body, having these emotions, experiencing these affects. And in order to confirm that reality, I have to actually see myself. We know this, for example, in psychology, that if someone goes out without seeing their reflection for too long of a time, they will start to go mad from this lack of a reflection. And Lacan is going to play with this in a bit, as we will see. But it is important that we have ourselves recognized and reflected. Otherwise, we enter a sort of solipsistic, self-destructive narcissism. But Lacan mentions that there's a particular relationship to narcissism here because we are forced to become enamored with our image, with the duplication of ourselves. And with this fragmentation of ourselves, that means that we will always, the reflection that we see is always asymptotically approaching what we feel of as ourselves. But nevertheless, I will never be able to be that image I see. Because the whole reason that image is what it is because it is different from me. So when the child sees itself in such a case, it enters a social situation. Lacan says, for the total form of his body, by which the subject anticipates the maturation of his power in a mirage, is given to him only as a gestalt, as a figure of some kind that I act out. That is, in an exteriority in which, to be sure, this form is more constitutive than constituted, but in which, above all, it appears to him as the contour of his stature that freezes it, and in a symmetry that reverses it, in opposition to the turbulent movements with which the subject feels he animates it. Right? So you have this turbulent case in which your image is flipped and mirrored. And this is kind of a fundamental alienation, that you will never be able to see yourself completely as other people see you. Even when you see yourself in a picture, you don't have the sort of subjective affectations that befall others when they see you, the sort of associations that your image makes in their own mind. You can only see it as it's interpreted by your own mind, which is already kind of supported by your own sense of selfhood. Through these two aspects of its appearance, this Gestalt symbolizes the eye's mental permanence, at the same time as it prefigures its alienating destination. This Gestalt is also replete with the correspondences that unite the eye with the statue onto which man projects themselves, the phantoms that dominate him, and the automaton with which the world of his own making tends to achieve fruition in an ambiguous relationship. So here we have a fundamental problem that is going to sort of act as the architecture for the entirety of Lacanian psychoanalysis. There is always an ambiguous relationship between the subject and his own self. One is always going to be slightly divorced from this sense of my authentic self, from my perfect self. What Lacan wants to do in psychoanalysis is he wants to learn how the subject can become confronted with their own history such that they can project themselves into the future, such that they can throw themselves into a future, that they can wrest from these images without doing away with the images. Because this is one of the important things about Lacan. Lacan detests certain schools of thought, such as like logical positivism, that is going to reduce something to its empirical verifiability. Such that, for example, if I have a hallucination, what makes that statement meaningful is whether or not it can be empirically verified and what the empirical verification brings back. So if I hallucinate something that's not there and the logical positivist finds out that, what you were hallucinating wasn't actually there, then they're going to say that your hallucination is meaningless. It literally has no meaning because it has no empirical referent. Now, Lacan is very different because Lacan actually privileges phantasms, images, chimera, phenomena, appearances, all this kind of stuff. He's very indebted to phenomenology in this way, and he is in many ways continuing the phenomenology of the subject of someone like Hegel. He also mentions Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger at various points. And what he says is that the function of the mirror stage thus turns out to be a particular case of the function of imagos, which is to say images, which is to establish a relationship between an organism and its reality, or as they say, between the Innenwelt and the Umwelt. Now, those latter terms are Heideggerian terms. Now, Heidegger didn't make them up. They're just German terms that already existed. But we have this inner world, which is my own world of what's going on in my sense of selfhood, in my mind, in my consciousness. And then the Umwelt, which is the around world or the environment. It's a necessarily social way in which I relate to a world that does not entirely depend on me. In fact, if anything, I depend on it. And this is what Lacan figures out. That because it's central to have a reflection of myself in order to know what it is to be a self at all, this shows the necessarily socially embodied function of the I function. But what happens here is a primordial discord is developed. He says this development is experienced as a temporal dialectic that decisively projects the individual's formation into history, right? Because at this moment, I start to see myself reflected in the world, and this can be developed and ruminated on through my consciousness, and I can decide what my relationship is to this self. The mirror stage is a drama whose internal pressure pushes precipitously from insufficiency to anticipation, and for the subject caught up in the lure of spatial identification, turns out fantasies that proceed from a fragmented image of the body to what I will call an orthopedic form of its totality. and to finally donned armor of an alienating identity that will mark his entire mental development with its rigid structure. Thus, the shattering of the innenwelt to the Umwelt circle gives rise to an inexhaustible squaring of the ego's audits. Right? So here we have a necessary alienation, which is the precondition for us to have a concept of the self of any kind. In other words, in order to be a self, I can never actually become that self. That's important. The subject's self-identification here coincides with its fragmentation qua other. And this is important because this kind of goes beyond the master-slave dialectic a bit, insofar as Hegel says that I have this identity, but in order for it to genuinely exist in and for itself and for others, it must exist equally for others as for myself. It must be recognized and thereby confirmed. But Lacan is essentially saying that the subject is never confirmed. What happens is we get this buildup of ego defenses, as he calls it, whereby the I function comes about through these defensive measures by which it tries to deny the nothingness of itself. As such, this is the time where he says that the specular I turns into the social I. In other words, this kind of hazy conception of I'm a thing experiencing things, this becomes socially confirmed and tied up with the presence of others at the moment of the mirror stage. This moment, Lacan says, at which the mirror stage comes to an end, inaugurates, through identification with the imago of one's semblable and the drama of primordial jealousy, the dialectic that will henceforth link the I to socially elaborated situations. Right? You naturally and necessarily get tied to your semblance in a social field. It is this moment that decisively tips the whole of human knowledge, savoir, into being mediated by the other's desire, constitutes its objects in an abstract equivalence due to competition from other people, and turns the I into an apparatus to which every instinctual pressure constitutes a danger, even if it corresponds to a natural maturation process. The very normalization of this maturation is henceforth dependent in man on cultural intervention, as is exemplified by the fact that sexual object choice is dependent upon the Oedipus complex. Now, of course, the Oedipus complex is not one of my favorite concepts in psychoanalysis. I'm with Deleuze and Guattari on this one, that it is wrought with problems. But nevertheless, we're seeing here that we necessarily see a maturation process by which cultural intervention becomes, or rather is discovered to have already been, the only place in which the self can exist. Think about the fact that, any animal that doesn't have a certain cognitive capacity, or a child that is never socialized, can never build up this concept of a self. They are developmentally stunted, and they are unable to actually articulate language. They're unable to have a sense of self-consciousness, or really the question would be, how would we confirm that if they can't tell us about it? Without this process of socialization, whereby one's concept of the self becomes reflected in that of others and dependent upon others, one can have no concept of a self. Now, in the presentation on psychical causality, Lacan links this notion of the mirror stage to that of madness. Because what he says happens at the mirror stage is that at the onset of the subject, it becomes dependent upon a fundamental méconnaissance, or misrecognition. Because one is forced to recognize oneself, this thing which is initially seen as interior, in something that is exterior. As such, the way in which one becomes acquainted with oneself, in which one sees this reflected, is essentially always to recognize oneself not as oneself. It is to be dependent upon imago, images. Thus, when we use the phrase self-image today, that's actually a pretty astute way to put it. Think about like social media, for example, like Instagram, where we have this notion that there is a real person behind the screen, that this is just an image, and that behind the image we get the real person. But Lacan says, what if the images are actually the fullest fruition of who we really are? What if, in fact, this is where our desires really get shown? How do I really want to be seen? What is my ideal self? My ego ideal? When I reflect myself into an image, I'm allowing my unconscious desires to be reflected into the world. And this thereby creates a fundamental misrecognition where my self-image is always in front of me. It is always something I am not, and I'm always trying to chase it, trying to fill this desire, which by definition for Lacan is a lack. It is an emptiness which needs to be filled. Now, this is different from Deleuze and Guattari, who are going to fundamentally go against this and say that no, actually desire is productive. It's not a lack at all, or an emptiness or a nothingness. But for Lacan, this notion of subjectivity is dependent upon essentially an empty subjecthood, whereby one misrecognizes oneself and thereby forms it. Such that we get, for example, theorists like Baudrillard, who are going to point out that, in fact, what if we are, in fact, simulacra, which is to say a copy without an original? Such that, for example, take an Instagram model. Their authentic self is to be an image. It's their job to be an image. Their life is enamored with the perfection of images, with the true embodiment of themselves in the image, such that they're always photogenic and always giving off exactly who they want to be. And maybe this is just a difference in degree, not in kind, from the usual social media user. Such that, in fact, there is no original behind the copy or the image, but rather the image is the way by which the self comes onto the scene. As such, this misrecognition is very interesting because Lacan says the risk of madness is gauged by the very appeal of the identifications on which man stakes both his truth and his being. Right? I stake my social value and existence on the way that I am perceived by others, by the kind of clothing I wear comes to identify me equally by the way that it is responded to by other people and the way that I internalize that response. Thus, Lacan says, rather than resulting from a contingent fact, the frailties of his organism, madness is the permanent virtuality of a gap opened up in his existence. In other words, this madness coincides with subjectivity. And far from being an insult to freedom, madness is freedom's most faithful companion, following its move like a shadow. Not only can man's being not be understood without madness, but it would not be man's being if it did not bear madness within himself as the limit of his freedom. It is certainly true, to interrupt this serious talk with something humorous from my youth, which I wrote in a pithy form on the wall in the hospital staff room, that not just anyone can go mad. But it is also true that not just anyone who wants to can run the risks that enshroud madness. A weak organism, a deranged imagination, and conflicts beyond one's capacities do not suffice to cause madness. It may well be that a rock-solid body, powerful identifications, and the indulgence of fate as written in the stars lead one more surely to find madness seductive. And think about like all the great artists, right? Think about Friedrich Hölderlin or Nietzsche, or, there's tons of other artists, I don't know why I'm just thinking of Germans right now, but who are insane. This is part of their fate, is that there's something about being enamored with the truth of reality, or the discovering of the truth of reality through the artistic process, by which one almost becomes enamored by one's own madness. This is something Lacan sees really as just being accentuated in these extreme cases, solely by difference of degree and not of kind. This madness is hidden in all of us, and the denial of it is one of the really great sins, one could say. And Lacan says that with the mirror stage, we get a fundamental aspect of the imago, which is that the observable effects of a form, in the broadest sense of the term, that can only be defined in terms of generic resemblance, thus implying that a certain recognition occurred prior to that. Because as Lacan says earlier in this essay, misrecognition depends on some sense of recognition. Because a misrecognition, the miss, means that it is a false recognition relative to some authentic recognition. So, right, we have some familiarity with the self. That's how we can even talk to each other, is I know the position that I embody relative to you. I can differentiate between self and other. At least I can kind of, if you give me the extremes of I'm all the way over here and you're all the way over here, I can say that this is self and this is other. Now, if we're engaged in like a really intimate experience, maybe these two kind of come together and the lines really blur more than usual. But this ability to misrecognize oneself, this méconnaissance in the imago, in the mirror stage, is essentially dependent upon the fact that we know it's not ourselves, that we know it's a duplication, that we know that's not actually me, but rather it's a mapped, mirrored version of me, because I'm over here and the mirror is over there. So this fundamental separated gulf creates this very curious dialectic that seems to be hiding a nothingness of the subject. Hence, for example, Zizek's book, Less Than Nothing, because the subject is essentially less than nothing. Thus, Lacan says, and this is an essential point, the first affect of the imago that appears in human beings is that of the subject's alienation. It is in the other that the subject first identifies himself and even experiences himself. This phenomenon will seem less surprising if we recall the fundamental social conditions of the human Umwelt and we invoke the intuition that dominates all of Hegel's speculations. Man's very desire is constituted, he tells us, under the sign of mediation. This is that dialectic of recognition I was talking about. It is the desire to have one's own desire recognized. Its object is a desire, that of other people, in the sense that man has no object that is constituted for his desire without some mediation, right? I don't have a desire unless I'm being mediated by the world. For example, if I have the desire for water because I'm thirsty, that's dependent on my body being lacking relative to some standard which the world has, which compels me to go out into the world and seek that. This is clear from his earliest needs, in that, for example, his very food must be prepared. And we find this anew in the whole development of his satisfaction, beginning with the conflict between master and slave, through the entire dialectic of labor. This dialectic, which is that of man's very being, must bring out, through a series of crises, the synthesis of his particularity and his universality, going so far as to universalize this very particularity. This is the master-slave dialectic, right? One's identity becomes universalized, becomes reified in the world of actually being in and of itself and in and for itself and for others through its particularization as another. This means that in the movement that leads man to an ever more adequate consciousness of himself, his freedom becomes bound up with the development of his servitude. Right? I'm not an island, and I need others more than I think I do. You'll know this if you get cooped up in your room for too long and you realize you need human contact, right? And this is dependent upon the affective experience, which is the conflict here, which is the need to somehow resolve this and find some autonomy, which depends precisely on the deference of this autonomy to the other. So that being said, I hope that this has helped make sense of some of the parts from this notoriously difficult work. Check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you want to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap, and I'd appreciate anything you have to give, but no pressure. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.